Between Denmark and Germany lies a strip of open water called the Fehmarnbelt, 18 kilometers wide, battered by North Sea winds and crossed by ferries for more than a century. It looks unremarkable on a map, a narrow gap between two friendly nations, but it has quietly acted as one of the most stubborn bottlenecks in European transport, forcing every car, truck, and train heading north into Scandinavia to either sail across it or detour hundreds of kilometers around the Baltic Sea. For decades, engineers and politicians debated whether to fix that bottleneck with a bridge, but ultimately chose a far stranger solution: burying an entire highway and railway under the seabed itself, out of sight, out of the weather, and out of the way of passing ships. Shipping lanes through the strait are among the busiest in the Baltic, so any fixed crossing had to avoid disrupting the constant flow of cargo vessels heading toward Kiel and beyond, a constraint that ruled out a conventional bridge from the very start of the planning process. The result is the Fehmarnbelt Fixed Link, a project so large it barely resembles a normal construction site. When it opens, it will be the longest immersed tunnel on the planet, stretching the full 18 kilometers between the Danish island of Lolland and the German island of Fehmarn. Unlike a mountain tunnel bored through solid rock, this one is being built in enormous prefabricated sections on dry land, then floated out to sea and sunk into a trench carved across the bottom of the strait. Nothing on this scale, combining both a motorway and a railway inside one submerged structure, has ever been attempted before, and engineers openly admit they are writing new rules for underwater construction as the project advances. Danish authority Femern AS oversees the entire build, coordinating hundreds of subcontractors, dredging fleets, and factory workers across two countries in what amounts to one continuous, decade-long industrial operation. The scale of the individual pieces is almost impossible to picture. Each concrete tunnel segment weighs roughly 73,000 tons, heavier than a fully loaded aircraft carrier, and engineers will need 79 of them laid end to end to complete the crossing. They are cast at a purpose-built factory on the Danish coast at Rodbyhavn, where rebar, concrete, and steel are assembled with tolerances measured in millimeters, under climate-controlled conditions designed to prevent cracking during curing. The factory itself has become one of the largest active construction sites in Northern Europe, employing thousands of workers around the clock to keep pace with a schedule stretching across nearly a decade. Land was reclaimed from the sea just to build the factory itself, an artificial peninsula created solely to manufacture pieces of a tunnel that will later be sunk back into the water it was built beside. Getting each finished segment into position is its own engineering feat. A specialized flotation and lowering vessel tows the massive concrete block out into open water, positions it precisely above the pre-dredged trench, then floods internal ballast chambers to sink it slowly and deliberately toward the seabed. Divers and remotely operated submersibles guide the final alignment in near-zero visibility, because a misalignment of just a few centimeters could threaten the watertight seal between segments meant to hold for 100 years. Once locked into place against its neighbor, each piece is welded, sealed, and buried under a protective layer of rock and gravel before the next segment begins its own slow journey out to sea. The entire dredging operation alone required removing roughly 19 million cubic meters of seabed material, enough to fill thousands of Olympic swimming pools. Most of it later reused to reclaim new land along the Danish coastline. Inside the finished tunnel will run 2 electrified rail tracks alongside a 4-lane motorway, split into separate parallel tubes for safety, with service passages, ventilation shafts, and emergency escape routes built between them in case of fire or breakdown. Trains will be able to cross the strait in about 7 minutes, and cars in roughly 10, compared with the 45 minutes a ferry crossing has always demanded, not counting the time spent waiting to board. For millions of travelers moving between Scandinavia and continental Europe each year, an entire sea crossing will effectively vanish from their journey, replaced by a stretch of road and rail no different from any other kilometre of highway. Sensors embedded throughout the structure will continuously monitor pressure, temperature, and structural stress, feeding data to control centres that can shut a tube within seconds if anything drifts outside safe operating limits. The ripple effects reach far beyond Denmark and Germany. A train journey from Copenhagen to Hamburg is expected to shrink by close to 1 hour once the fixed link opens, and freight that currently sails around the Baltic or queues for scarce ferry space will be able to move in an unbroken line from Stockholm through Denmark, under the strait, and on toward Rome or Paris without a single stop at sea. The project is designed to plug a long missing gap in the European Union's trans-European transport network, the backbone of road and rail corridors meant to bind the continent's economies more tightly together for decades to come. Planners in Brussels have long treated the Fehmarnbelt as the last major gap in that northern corridor, the single missing link standing between Scandinavia and seamless overland access to the rest of the European Union. None of this comes cheap. The Fehmarnbelt fixed link carries a price tag of roughly €7.5 billion, financed largely through loans backed by the Danish state and structured to be repaid over decades by tolls charged to drivers and rail operators using the crossing. Denmark is effectively betting its own treasury on the idea that faster trade, tourism, and mobility between Scandinavia and the rest of Europe will generate enough long-term economic activity to justify the debt, a wager that will not be fully settled until long after the current generation of taxpayers has retired. The European Union has contributed grant funding toward the project as well, treating it as strategic infrastructure important enough to the entire bloc to justify shared financial support. That bet has not gone unchallenged. For more than a decade, German environmental organizations fought the tunnel through the courts, arguing that dredging a trench across the Fehmarnbelt would devastate a fragile marine ecosystem shared by harbor porpoises, migratory seabirds, and rare seafloor habitats found almost nowhere else in the Baltic Sea. Legal challenges delayed groundbreaking for years, forcing planners to redesign elements of the project, fund conservation programs, and commit to decades of environmental monitoring, an acknowledgement that the tunnel's footprint on marine life could never simply be dismissed or ignored. Germany's highest administrative court ultimately allowed construction to proceed only after years of appeals, a ruling that satisfied planners but left many local conservation groups feeling their concerns had simply been outlasted rather than resolved. Ferry operators fought just as hard for far more practical reasons. The Puttgarden to Rodby ferry route has carried cars, trucks, and passengers across the strait since 1963, generating jobs and steady revenue on both coastlines for generations of local families. A tunnel that erases the crossing in 10 minutes also erases the business model built around the 45-minute voyage, and operators warned repeatedly of job losses and stranded infrastructure on both sides of the water. Tensions that were never fully resolved even after construction finally broke ground. Scandlines, the company running the ferries, has since diversified into hybrid and electric vessels, partly to extend its relevance on other routes once the Fehmarnbelt crossing it depends on most disappears for good. Construction finally broke ground in 2020 after more than a decade of environmental review, legal appeals, and political negotiation between Copenhagen and Berlin that repeatedly threatened to collapse the entire agreement. On the German side, the once quiet harbour town of Puttgarden has been transformed, almost overnight, into a frontier of cranes, work camps, and heavy machinery. A jarring shift for a community that had spent generations defined by its ferry traffic and rural coastline rather than international mega-project construction on this scale. Local businesses have had to adapt overnight, some closing as ferry traffic wound down, others opening to serve the thousands of construction workers who now fill hotels and rental housing across the region. Thousands of workers from across Europe now live and labour along both shores of the strait, running what has become one of the continent's largest active infrastructure sites, complete with dedicated housing complexes, logistics hubs, and its own internal transport network just to keep materials and personnel moving efficiently. Coordinating a workforce and supply chain this large across 2 countries, 2 languages, and 2 separate regulatory systems has become almost as demanding a challenge as the underwater engineering itself, requiring constant negotiation between Danish and German authorities. Even something as simple as differing electrical standards, labour rules, and safety codes between the 2 countries has forced planners to build entirely new shared procedures just to keep both sides of the tunnel meeting in the middle correctly. Engineers building the tunnel must also solve a problem no ordinary road tunnel ever faces: designing a structure meant to sit permanently beneath the corrosive pressure of the Baltic Sea for at least a century without failure. Every concrete segment is reinforced against water infiltration, salt corrosion, and the slow structural fatigue of decades submerged under shifting tides, storms, and the occasional passing cargo ship overhead. Engineering standards built not for the next election cycle, but for generations of drivers and passengers who have not yet been born. Independent auditors regularly review the design against similar immersed tunnels already operating elsewhere in the world, checking that materials and methods still hold up to real-world performance data decades after those earlier projects opened. Officials currently expect the Fehmarnbelt fixed link to open to traffic in 2029, nearly a decade after the first concrete element was cast at Rødbyhavn. Like most megaprojects of this size, the timeline has already shifted more than once, and engineers caution that a project involving custom-built vessels, untested logistics, and marine construction at this scale leaves little room for complacency, even as the majority of tunnel segments have now been successfully placed and sealed along the seabed trench. Once traffic begins flowing, the ferry route it replaces is expected to shut down entirely within a matter of months, closing a chapter of cross-Baltic travel that has lasted more than 60 years. If the project succeeds on schedule and on budget, it will do something no bridge or ferry route has managed in the history of the crossing: make the border between Denmark and Germany functionally disappear for anyone traveling by road or rail. A drive that once meant checking ferry schedules and standing in a boarding line will become as unremarkable as merging onto any ordinary European motorway. A sea crossing quietly erased from the map by burying it rather than building over it in the open air. Regional planners already expect new commuter patterns to emerge, with residents on the Danish island of Lolland able to work in northern Germany and return home the same evening for the first time in history. Yet the tunnel also stands as a test case for how far a single nation is willing to go to reshape geography in the name of connectivity, absorbing years of litigation, billions of euros in national debt, and lasting damage to a local ferry economy, all to shave under an hour off a single train ride between two capital regions. Whether that trade proves worth it will not be judged this decade, but by the volume of trucks, trains, and travelers still crossing beneath the Baltic long after everyone who approved the project has left public office entirely. Supporters call it visionary infrastructure investment. Critics call it a debt-fueled gamble on traffic projections that may never fully materialize. And both sides agree the answer will take a full generation to reveal itself. For now, the Fehmarnbelt remains a strip of open water, still crossed the old way by ferry, while the tunnel slowly takes shape beneath it, segment by segment, year by year, largely hidden from view beneath the waves. But within a few years, ferries that have sailed this route continuously since the 1960s will make their final crossings, and a stretch of sea that separated two nations for centuries will simply become a road most drivers cross without even noticing they left dry land. What took generations of ferries, decades of debate, and billions of euros to accomplish will ultimately be remembered, if it works, as nothing more dramatic than a tunnel nobody thinks twice about driving through.